Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place where frost clings to broken buildings and the air tastes of dust and cordite. Picture it, a vast frigid plain stretching eastward, broken only by a winding ribbon of river, the mighty Volga. It's late summer 1942. German tanks, their armor streaked with mud, roll across the Russian steppe. The skies above buzz with Luftwaffe planes, and thousands of boots churn the soil as the German Sixth Army advances toward a name that would soon echo through history: Stalingrad. This wasn't just another city. It was the key to the South. With it, Hitler believed he could choke off Soviet oil supplies and strike a blow that would shatter the Red Army's will to fight. But Stalin, equally stubborn, ordered that the city be defended at all costs. And so, a fight was set into motion that would burn itself into the annals of warfare and into the minds of all who survived it. The German advance started with confidence. Operation Blue, launched in June 1942, aimed to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and secure the Volga River. Hitler had grown obsessed with Stalingrad, not because it was the most strategic prize on the board, but because it bore Stalin's name. Taking it would be a personal humiliation to his Soviet counterpart, a feather in the Führer's increasingly erratic cap. The Wehrmacht swept through southern Russia with speed and brutality, taking city after city. By late August, elements of the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. They expected a swift operation. Blitzkrieg had worked wonders before. Why not here? But here's the thing: Stalingrad wasn't like the others. The city was stretched thin along the western bank of the Volga, a narrow, elongated urban zone hemmed in by the river on one side and the vast steppes on the other. Crossing that river was the only way to reinforce the city. And the Soviets weren't about to give it up without a fight. The Luftwaffe began its work with predictable cruelty. On August 23rd, over 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped in a single day. Fires tore through wooden houses and apartment blocks. Civilians were caught in the open. Entire districts became smoking craters. Soviet authorities had delayed evacuation orders, so tens of thousands of people were still in the city when the first bombs fell. Many never left. Amid this chaos, the first German infantry units crossed into the northern suburbs. They found not surrender but fierce resistance. Soviet forces, hastily reinforced by civilians and militia units, dug into the ruins. The Red Army wasn't giving up. They were just getting started. The Volga, meanwhile, ran red. Soviet boats ferried reinforcements across the river under constant German fire. Men disembarked under machine gun bursts, many dying before they even set foot on land. Yet they came night after night, whole divisions crossing in the dark, freezing and soaking wet, often without weapons, told simply to pick one up from the next man who fell. The Germans were unnerved. This wasn't the fast-paced war they knew. It was as if the city itself fought back, each pile of bricks, each ruined stairwell becoming a fresh stronghold. Snipers hid in chimneys. Mortars were fired from the basements of gutted buildings. Progress was measured not in miles, but in meters. By mid-September, the Germans held most of the city's outer districts. But the Soviets controlled key strongpoints near the riverbanks, granaries, factories, apartment blocks, now reduced to skeletal ruins. Hitler, refusing to let up, demanded total victory. Stalin, for his part, issued order number 227, not a step back. And so began one of the most punishing and surreal battles of the Second World War. A city transformed into a maze of death, where the front line ran through stairwells, bedrooms, and sewer tunnels. No one was safe, and no one could escape. Stalingrad wasn't just any city. It was Stalin's city, and that alone turned it into a symbol neither side could afford to lose. For Hitler, capturing it would prove that Nazi Germany could crush the Soviet Union at will. For Stalin, defending it was a matter of personal pride and political survival. When your name is literally stamped on the map, retreat looks a lot like surrender. Strategically, the city sat along the Volga River, an essential artery for transporting fuel, grain, and goods from the southern regions to the rest of the Soviet Union. Losing it would have fractured Soviet logistics and opened the door to the oil-rich Caucasus. But beyond the maps and the resources, Stalingrad had taken on a life of its own, an icon of defiance, a concrete embodiment of total war. When German forces closed in during August 1942, they expected the Red Army to fold. After all, the Soviets had already lost massive territory, millions of soldiers, and several major cities since Operation Barbarossa began. But what they didn't count on was that by now, Stalin's army had learned a thing or two, especially about not giving up. The civilians who remained, estimates vary from tens to hundreds of thousands, had no choice but to stay and survive. Children helped dig trenches. Women worked in weapons factories that continued producing even as bombs fell around them. In one of the city's tractor factories, tanks were assembled by day and driven straight into combat by night. Imagine building a tank and then climbing into it the same hour, driving it straight through a brick wall into battle. That's not metaphor. That's what actually happened. The geography of Stalingrad made everything worse. The city stretched some 30 miles along the Volga, but was only a few miles deep. That meant the front line was always just a stone's throw from the supply line. The Volga itself became a lifeline and a graveyard. Crossing it meant braving dive bombers and artillery. Staying behind it meant abandoning the city to its fate. But Stalin had made it clear no one was allowed to fall back. His infamous Order No. 227, issued in July 1942, decreed not a step back. Anyone caught retreating without orders could be, and often was, executed. Behind the front lines, Soviet blocking detachments were stationed to enforce the rule. In other words, you were more likely to survive by running at the enemy than running from them. In response to the German invasion, the Soviets rushed troops into the city with breathtaking speed and desperation. Entire divisions were thrown into battle with barely any training, often without winter gear, and in some cases with little more than rifles and grenades. The phrase "two men, one rifle" isn't just a dramatic exaggeration from a movie script. In many cases, it reflected the grim reality of supply shortages, and yet they held. By late September, the battle had devolved into a grim routine. The Germans would launch daily assaults, inching forward street by street. The Soviets would counterattack often at night, pushing them back a few blocks. Buildings changed hands 10-20 times. A single apartment block might be garrisoned by Germans on the ground floor, Soviets in the attic, and both sides trading grenades through holes blown in the walls. Snipers played a huge role in this bizarre new battlefield. Stalingrad's ruined skyline offered hundreds of hiding spots, and both sides used them to deadly effect. The Soviets in particular elevated sniping to both an art and a psychological weapon. One name in particular began to echo across the rubble: Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd turned sharpshooter whose kill count rose into the hundreds. Soviet propaganda turned him into a living legend, and whether or not all the stories are true, they did their job unnerving the Germans and rallying the Red Army. The Germans, meanwhile, had brought their best. The Sixth Army, considered elite, was bolstered by armored divisions and supported by the Fourth Panzer Army to the south. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and completely unprepared for the kind of war Stalingrad demanded. This was not the clean, fast warfare of Poland or France. This was something else, something messier, grittier, and far more personal. Take the Mamayev Kurgan, for example, a large hill overlooking the city. It offered a commanding view and was critical for artillery targeting. The hill changed hands dozens of times. Entire regiments were wiped out trying to hold or take it. By the end, the soil was so saturated with blood metal and bone that grass wouldn't grow there for years. The deeper into the city the Germans pushed, the worse it became. Every step forward meant tighter streets, closer combat, and more Soviet ambushes. Flamethrowers became common. So did bayonets. Sometimes soldiers resorted to fighting with entrenching tools and bare hands. And despite the horror, neither Hitler nor Stalin would blink. Each believed that victory was close, just one more push, one more wave of troops. But Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It had become a crucible where empires would either be forged or destroyed. By October 1942, the battle had morphed into something truly grotesque. Urban warfare, already a messy affair, was elevated in Stalingrad to a level few soldiers had ever imagined. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened into twisted skeletons of concrete and steel. And yet the fighting didn't slow. It just got more personal, more desperate. The term meat grinder gets tossed around a lot, but in Stalingrad, it was practically a daily weather report. German troops referred to it as Rattenkrieg Rat War, and it wasn't a compliment. Soldiers crawled through sewer systems, basements, air ducts, anything to outflank or surprise the enemy. A single room could erupt in firefight after firefight, sometimes within the same hour. And every time the smoke cleared, someone else was squatting behind a doorway, waiting. The Volga, once a great lifeline of trade and travel, now resembled more of a conveyor belt for the dying. Soviet reinforcements were still crossing it nightly, many under cover of darkness, hugging the icy water as German shells splashed around them. They knew the odds, and still they came. The German Sixth Army, under General Paulus, had clawed its way into the city's industrial north. They pushed into the tractor factory, the Barricadi factory, the Red October factory. Yes, all real names, all real nightmares. These weren't just places where machinery was once made. They had become hardened fortresses filled with Soviet troops who knew the layout like the back of their hand. Take the tractor factory. Before the war, it built farm equipment. Now it churned out tanks during the day and turned into a front line at night. Assembly lines were littered with corpses. Cranes dangled over the battlefield, seized by snipers as makeshift watchtowers. It was surreal, almost theatrical, if it weren't so hideously real. Germans had the advantage in firepower. They brought in tanks, Stukas, flamethrowers, artillery. But none of that helped much in a battle fought hallway by hallway. A tank isn't much use when it can't turn in a narrow alley, and the Soviets were experts at ambushing them from the ruins above. Sometimes they let a tank roll forward, then pounced on it from 3 floors up with Molotov cocktails or bundles of grenades. Boom. One more pile of flaming metal on the street. And if you think the front lines were bad, wait until you hear about the rear. Medical supplies were laughably scarce. The wounded were stacked into makeshift hospitals, often cold basements filled with mudblood, and very little hope. Food, a luxury. German rations were dwindling, and the Soviets were often living on 100 grams of bread a day, sometimes mixed with sawdust. Yes, sawdust. Because flour was precious, and hunger didn't care what it tasted like. Still, the fighting dragged on. Both sides threw in everything they had. Soviet generals like Vasily Chuikov, who led the 62nd Army, had orders from Stalin himself. Hold the city or die in it. Chuikov took that seriously. He kept his headquarters perilously close to the front, sometimes only a few hundred meters behind the trenches. He figured if his men saw him taking the same risks, they'd fight harder. And they did. There were moments of strange, bitter humor. One German officer joked in a letter that he was no longer measuring progress in city blocks, but in staircases. Another described how they stopped wearing boots to bed, not because it was comfortable, but because rats would chew on the leather while they slept. By now, both armies were in rough shape. The Germans were exhausted, the Soviets barely better. And yet somehow, the fighting intensified. You'd think they'd have run out of energy or ammunition or buildings. But Stalingrad just refused to be finished. It wasn't only soldiers caught in this madness. Civilians who had survived the initial bombing raids were still trapped in the ruins, doing their best to stay invisible. They lived in underground shelters, cellars, bombed-out trolley cars, anywhere that offered protection. A few even helped the Red Army by cooking, mending, or gathering intelligence. One teenage girl became famous for delivering water under fire. Another, barely 12, acted as a scout, and yet every passing day brought more destruction. Snow began to fall in late October. The wind off the Volga turned wet clothes to icy armor. Frostbite became just as deadly as bullets. Weapons jammed from the cold. Soldiers lit fires in the hulls of tanks just to stay alive. But no one was retreating. Not because they didn't want to, but because they weren't allowed to. The city was now a labyrinth of frozen corpses and shattered brick. And still, the orders were the same. Take the city. Hold the city. No step back. The battle had stopped being about strategy weeks ago. This was something else now. Something primal. A test of endurance, of will, of whose nightmare would last longer. As the days shortened and the snow deepened, another kind of warfare took hold in Stalingrad, one that didn't rely on artillery or tanks, but on patience nerves and an uncanny ability to remain invisible in a city full of eyes. This was the sniper's war, and in the winter-scarred ruins of the city, it became one of the deadliest games imaginable. Imagine the scene: twisted staircases, broken window frames, burnt-out tramcars. Everywhere you looked, there was a place to hide. And for snipers on both sides, every inch of concrete offered a chance to turn a simple intersection into a kill zone. The city was eerily silent at times, with sudden bursts of rifle fire echoing like ghostly punctuation marks. in a story no one wanted to read. The Soviets, in particular, elevated sniping into both a tactical and psychological weapon. They built entire squads whose job was not to win ground, but to sap German morale by making every step dangerous. Climbing a ladder risk, crossing a courtyard risk, even poking your head up to take a look. Definitely risk. And then there was Vasily Zaitsev. You've probably heard the name maybe from a film or a book or whispered in old war stories. But in Stalingrad, Zaitsev wasn't a celebrity. He was a ghost. A Siberian hunter turned Red Army sniper, Zaitsev used the snow-dusted ruins like a hunting ground. He killed over 200 German soldiers in just a few weeks, including enemy snipers sent specifically to find and eliminate him. One of the more dramatic and still debated stories from this period was the so-called sniper duel between Zaitsev and a German master sniper sent from Berlin. The two reportedly played a multi-day game of cat and mouse across the ruins, hiding in pipe shadows and corpses. In the end, Zaitsev won. Or so the legend goes. True or not, the story spread like wildfire. And that was the point. Propaganda thrives on heroes, especially when they carry a rifle and wear a fur-lined hat. Sniping wasn't limited to famous names, of course. Thousands of Soviet and German marksmen took part in the urban duel. They learned to shoot through tiny gaps, to aim at reflections in broken glass, and to disappear before anyone could spot the muzzle flash. Many operated in pairs, one to shoot, one to spot. It was exhausting work, demanding total focus, steady hands, and a complete disregard for the passage of time. Germans, for their part, developed counter-sniper squads and tried to flush out these invisible threats with grenades, flamethrowers, or entire patrols. But often, they simply didn't see it coming. A shot from an unseen window, a thud, and another helmet hit the floor. The psychological effect of snipers was immense. German soldiers started to fear the quiet as much as the shelling. They talked in hushed tones, avoided open ground, and hesitated before every movement. A city already ruled by chaos now had to contend with an invisible layer of dread. And while the snipers were stalking each other, the rest of the city was becoming increasingly uninhabitable. Buildings that hadn't yet collapsed were slowly being hollowed out by fire ice and artillery. Entire streets vanished in avalanches of brick and dust. Smoke hung so thick in the air that even on clear days the sun felt like a myth. And yet in this horror, people kept fighting. Sometimes with a rifle, sometimes with a shovel, and sometimes with just the knowledge that if they didn't, someone else would suffer. There are stories, small ones, overlooked ones that somehow survived. Like the tale of a Soviet soldier who played the harmonica before battle, hoping to bring a few seconds of beauty into the ugliness. Or the nurse who kept a dog with her in the basement hospital because it barked before air raids hit and gave them time to move the wounded. These tiny flickers of humanity, the music, the dog, the warm breath on frozen hands, are what made the battle bearable, at least in memory. But don't mistake these as signs that life was manageable. It was anything but. Hunger, cold, and infection killed many more than bullets did. Both sides were stretched thin, scraping the bottom of the supply barrel. German troops were running low on ammunition, food, winter gear, everything. Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, often didn't even have winter coats. They stuffed newspapers into their uniforms for warmth and drank melted snow. And through it all, the snipers kept watching. There's something chilling about that. In a city already reduced to rubble, where tanks exploded like oversized firecrackers and grenades littered staircases like cursed candy, it was the silent assassins, patient, deliberate, unseen, who ruled the rooftops. In Stalingrad, every shadow had a scope behind it. Every brick wall hid a possible death. And yet, no one left. Because they couldn't. By November, the city of Stalingrad no longer looked like a city. It looked like a bad memory. The skyline was reduced to jagged teeth. The streets were indistinguishable from rubble. Fires still smoldered under collapsed ceilings. Smoke mingled with snow in the air. And somehow, amid all this, people were still alive, fighting, freezing, starving, surviving. If you're imagining clean uniforms and strategic maps, forget it. Life in Stalingrad had become something closer to medieval siege warfare, if medieval sieges had machine guns and hand grenades. There were no front lines anymore, only zones of slightly more or slightly less death. Let's talk about conditions, because it's easy to forget that beyond the bullets and the tactics were human bodies, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and pushed far past what most of us would call endurance. For the soldiers on both sides, sleep was a rare commodity. You didn't get a solid 8 hours in a warm bunk. You got half an hour in a corner before a shell exploded nearby. Or maybe you dozed off in a trench, only to wake up covered in ice and mud. A nap could cost you fingers to frostbite. A deep sleep might mean never waking up at all. Food. There was food, technically, but it was rarely edible and never enough. Soviet soldiers received meager rations of bread, often mixed with sawdust to stretch it. A slab of salted fish, if they were lucky. For the Germans, supply lines were strained thin across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. What made it through was cold stale or already spoiled, canned meat frozen into blocks, crackers that broke teeth. Water was scooped from the Volga when possible, often tainted with blood and fuel. The human body doesn't cope well in these conditions. Wounds that might have healed in normal times festered into infections. Amputations were performed with dirty knives and no anesthetic. Dysentery ran through the ranks like wildfire. Lice were everywhere. People burned uniforms just to get rid of them, then went back to the front half naked, and yet they stayed. Orders were clear: no retreat, no surrender. The civilians still trapped in the city suffered even more. Entire families huddled in basements, with no heat, waiting out days of shelling, with nothing but hope and a handful of potatoes. Children starved in the arms of mothers who had nothing left to give. Elderly citizens, too frail to dig or hide, simply sat and waited. Some froze to death. Others disappeared during bombing raids, never found again. But among the horror were moments of surreal perseverance. Teachers held classes in underground shelters. A small orchestra, missing half its members, played music in a ruined theater to keep morale alive. A soldier scribbled poetry on cigarette papers. It wasn't about optimism. It was about stubbornness. About refusing to be erased. The Red Army's defense strategy hinged on this kind of grit. General Chuikov's troops used the terrain, or what was left of it, to their advantage. They turned wreckage into bunkers. Mines were buried in staircases. Anti-tank teams waited behind piles of bricks for the chance to strike. The The Germans were forced to clear every room, every hallway, knowing a machine gun could open fire from a wardrobe. And it was working, but just barely. The Soviets were hanging on, bloodied but unbroken. The Germans, despite months of fighting, still hadn't captured the whole city. Hitler had promised a swift victory. Now winter was settling in, and the Sixth Army was stuck in a nightmare of its own making. Even the Luftwaffe, once dominant, was losing control of the skies. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries had multiplied, and the Red Air Force, finally regrouped after its earlier beatings, was making life miserable for German supply planes. The frozen city was becoming a coffin, and the lid was slowly closing. But here's the part that rarely gets told in detail: the psychological collapse. German letters from this period, when they could be sent at all, speak of despair. Soldiers questioned why they were still there. Some asked to be transferred, some asked for food, some stopped asking altogether. One wrote to his wife, "The snow falls and falls. We fall with it." Another described Stalingrad as a place that is no longer a part of the world. Soviet morale, while battered, held stronger. Propaganda helped, of course, posters and radio messages praising the defenders, mocking the invaders, invoking Mother Russia. But more than that, there was rage, real simmering rage. They had seen what the German invasion had done: massacres, burned villages, cruelty beyond comprehension. For many Soviet soldiers, this was personal. And Stalingrad was where they drew the line, still personal or not. Both armies were nearing collapse. Supplies were drying up. Reinforcements were scarce. And winter was only getting worse. By the end of November, a kind of frozen purgatory had taken hold. There were no major movements, no decisive attacks, just endless skirmishes, artillery duels, and a slow, grinding sense of doom. The city had become a graveyard, not just for bodies, but for hope. And yet a storm was coming, one neither Hitler nor Paulus had fully anticipated. The Red Army wasn't just defending Stalingrad anymore. They were preparing to strike. By mid-November 1942, the German Sixth Army was locked in a death grip, with the Red Army in Stalingrad still hammering at factory walls and clinging to gutted buildings. But far to the north and south of the city, something was stirring. Soviet generals, after months of careful planning and deception, were about to pull off one of the most audacious moves of the entire war. It would be called Operation Uranus, and it would turn the tide of the Eastern Front in spectacular fashion. The brilliance of Operation Uranus wasn't in its complexity, it was in its timing and simplicity. Instead of attacking the strongest parts of the German line in Stalingrad itself, the Soviets decided to strike at the weak points, the flanks. These were held not by German troops, but by their allies, the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies. Brave, yes. Equipped for winter warfare and Soviet tanks, absolutely not. On November 19th, just as the Sixth Army was preparing for another day of brutal street fighting, Soviet artillery thundered to life north of the city. Thousands of shells screamed into the Romanian lines. Snow and smoke churned together. And then, through the white haze, came the tanks. Soviet armored divisions poured into the gap, smashing through defenses like they were made of papier-mâché. The Romanians fought back, but their weapons were outdated, their morale was brittle, and their communications lines were in shambles. Within hours, The northern front had collapsed. The very next day, on November 20th, the same thing happened to the south. Another Soviet hammer blow fell on the Romanian Fourth Army, opening a second breach. And just like that, the trap began to snap shut. By November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers, one from the north, one from the south, linked up in the town of Kalak, west of Stalingrad. And inside the encirclement, the entire German Sixth Army. Over 250,000 men, infantry, artillery, crews, engineers, medics, were now trapped, completely surrounded. At first, they didn't even believe it. Reports filtered in slowly. Commanders refused to accept the truth. After all, the Wehrmacht was supposed to be the encirclers, not the encircled. Hitler had said Stalingrad would fall. How could they be the ones now stuck in a tightening Soviet ring? But the facts were undeniable. The Soviets had pulled off a classic double envelopment, one of the oldest tricks in the military playbook, and they had done it on a scale few thought possible. It wasn't just a setback, it was a disaster. What made it worse, much worse, was Hitler's reaction. When German field commanders suggested a breakout, abandoning the city and fighting west to link up with friendly forces, Hitler flatly refused. He ordered General Paulus to hold Stalingrad. No retreat, no surrender. Supplies would be flown in by air, and the Sixth Army would continue fighting until relieved. This was in theory bold. In reality, it was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, promised to deliver 300 tons of supplies per day: food, ammunition, medical gear. In practice, they managed about 80 tons on a good day. Often, they delivered much less. Some days, nothing at all. And so the men inside the pocket, what became known as the Kessel or cauldron, began a slow, steady slide into ruin. Outside the pocket, Soviet forces dug in. They built layers of defenses, set up artillery, and prepared for the long haul. They weren't going to let this fish slip off the hook. Not after everything Stalingrad had cost them. Inside, the situation deteriorated quickly. Fuel ran low. Vehicles froze. Wounded soldiers piled up in unheated buildings. Rations were slashed. Horses were eaten. Then dogs. Then rats. There are confirmed reports of soldiers boiling leather belts and boots just to make something vaguely chewable. Medical supplies were practically non-existent. Amputations were done with saws and vodka if you were lucky. Morphine ran out fast. Some soldiers began to hallucinate from cold hunger or infection. Command posts reported increasing signs of delirium breakdowns and suicide. And still they fought, because the orders were clear, and the idea of disobeying Hitler remained unthinkable. Paulus, trapped by loyalty and fear, refused to act without direct permission. And permission never came. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, monitored everything. They knew they had the Germans in a stranglehold, but they weren't going to rush the kill. Not yet. They reinforced their lines. They watched the Kessel shrink. And they waited for the freezing winter to do its work. And oh, did winter oblige. Temperatures in the steppe dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Wind whipped across the plains, icing over rifles and cracking lips. Soldiers huddled in ruins and dugouts, burning anything that would catch Flamebook's furniture, sometimes their own gear. It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about surviving the night. Back in Germany, the mood shifted. Propaganda still spoke of heroism and sacrifice, of the brave men holding out against impossible odds. But whispers were growing. Why hadn't the Sixth Army broken out? Why had Hitler let them stay? The truth, of course, was more complex and far more damning. The German High Command had gambled everything on a city named after their enemy. And now that gamble was crumbling with every freezing, starving day. Operation Uranus had not just turned the tide at Stalingrad. It had shattered the illusion that the Wehrmacht was unbeatable. It proved the Soviets could outplan, outfight, and outlast the Germans when it mattered most. And for the men trapped in the Kessel, the only thing left now was time. Once the jaws of Operation Uranus snapped shut around the German Sixth Army, the clock began ticking. Inside the cauldron, der Kessel General Friedrich Paulus found himself commanding 250,000 men with no realistic way out and an increasingly delusional command structure above him, insisting that salvation was on the way. The problem that salvation was never actually coming. Let's talk about why the Germans didn't break out. From a military perspective, there was a window maybe a few days after the encirclement when a breakout was still possible. Paulus had tanks. He had trucks. His forces weren't yet starving. But instead of acting, he hesitated. Or more accurately, he waited for instructions from Hitler. And Hitler, true to form, issued a command that would echo through history in the worst possible way: stand fast. That phrase doomed thousands. Hitler believed that the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring could resupply the trapped army by air. Göring, eager to impress the Führer, assured him that they could deliver the necessary 300 tons of supplies per day. In private, even his own air staff raised their eyebrows at that number. It was pure fantasy. Let's run the math quickly. The Sixth Army required at least 500 tons of supplies daily to function: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. Even under perfect flying conditions, the Luftwaffe's fleet couldn't deliver more than a third of that. And Stalingrad was not offering perfect conditions. Snow, wind, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical breakdowns, all took a toll. In reality, the average was closer to 80-90 tons per day, and some days dropped to zero. Entire flights went down in the steppe, shot out of the sky, or frozen solid. Pilots were flying obsolete patched-up aircraft. Crews had to navigate without proper maps. Many had never flown in such bitter cold, and what they did manage to deliver often wasn't what was most needed. There are documented cases of planes landing with crates of vodka or summer uniforms. One particularly memorable load contained curry powder. That's not a joke. Meanwhile, Soviet forces outside the Kessel were making sure no one escaped. They didn't just encircle, they fortified the encirclement. Minefields, trenches, tank traps, artillery batteries, sniper nests. It was a wall of death, and every attempt to break through it ended in fire and screams. Inside conditions deteriorated from grim to grotesque. By December, the rations for a German soldier inside the cauldron had dropped to just 200 grams of bread per day. And that bread was bulked out with sawdust. Horse meat, when available, was a rare treat. Many soldiers survived on soup made from frozen potatoes, bits of bark, or sometimes nothing at all. Men dropped dead while on watch, frozen in place like statues. Wounded soldiers lay in makeshift medical stations, too cold to scream. There were no antibiotics, no bandages, no anesthetic. Some men lay for days with open wounds, conscious alert, and slowly dying. German letters from this time tell the story in painful fragments. One soldier wrote, "I no longer feel hunger. I feel emptiness. The cold has reached my soul." Another described eating boiled leather from his own belt. Some resorted to even darker methods of survival, the kind not talked about in official reports. Incredibly, Hitler continued to deny reality. He forbade any retreat and ordered the Sixth Army to hold out to the last man. A rescue operation, Operation Winter Storm, was launched in mid-December under General Erich von Manstein. Its goal was to reach the pocket and break the encirclement from the outside. For a brief moment, hope flickered. German tanks advanced across the icy steppe. Soldiers inside the Kessel waited breathlessly. But the Soviet lines were too strong and the reinforcements too thin. The relief force got within 30 miles and then stalled. Paulus, still waiting for permission to attempt a breakout, received none. Manstein's tanks never arrived, and Paulus never moved. It's hard to overstate how devastating this was. For the men in the pocket, it was the psychological equivalent of a death sentence. They knew they were not being saved. They knew they were not going home. And still orders kept coming from above. Fight on, hold your ground, protect the city. The city by now, it barely existed. Stalingrad had become little more than ash and echoes. Entire districts were gone. The iconic buildings, the factories, the train stations, the apartment blocks were now just landmarks of suffering. The Volga was frozen solid. The ruins howled with wind, and yet the battle continued. Even the Red Army couldn't believe the Germans were still resisting. Soviet soldiers described finding whole units of frost-bitten enemies still clinging to wrecked buildings. They looked like corpses, one wrote, but they were still shooting. And yet this madness had purpose. For Stalin, the longer the Germans stayed trapped, the more symbolic their defeat became. He wanted the world to see that Hitler's army wasn't invincible, that fascism could bleed, that victory wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. So the Soviets didn't rush the final blow. They tightened the noose. They waited for the weather, for hunger, for hopelessness to do the work. By January, the Kessel had shrunk dramatically. The Sixth Army no longer held the city. They were crammed into a frozen wedge near the airfields, if you could call them that. Supplies barely arrived, bodies piled up, ammunition was scarce, and General Paulus, once a rising star, sat in a basement, waiting for orders that no longer made sense. He would receive one final order soon, but not the one he expected. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army was barely an army at all. It was a starving, freezing, broken mass of humanity huddled in the ruins of a dead city. Once proud and disciplined units now resembled ragged bands of survivors. Many had no weapons, most had no food, all had no hope. And yet Hitler still refused to let them surrender. In Berlin, the Nazi high command clung to the fantasy that Stalingrad could be held if only a miracle arrived. But inside the Kessel, reality was unavoidable. Temperatures hovered around -30°C. Soldiers wrapped themselves in curtains and straw, in the clothing of the dead. The snow had long since stopped being white. It was grey, filthy, and soaked with blood. The Soviets had now surrounded the Germans with overwhelming force. Over 1 million Red Army troops, thousands of tanks, and countless artillery pieces formed a tight ring. They launched a new offensive in early January to finish what they had begun. This time, there would be no delay. Soviet guns opened fire day and night. The Kessel shrank with alarming speed. Villages and airfields, already battered, were overrun. Key positions, like Pitomnik and Gumrak airfields, were captured, severing the last lifeline. No more supplies, no more wounded evacuated. The Sixth Army was now completely cut off from food, fuel, escape, and fantasy. Inside the ruins, German troops prepared for the end. Hospitals overflowed. Wounded men lay in corridors, stairwells, and snowbanks. Supplies had been so low for so long that doctors were performing amputations with hacksaws, sometimes without even a mouthful of alcohol to dull the pain. And yet there was no formal surrender. Not yet. General Friedrich Paulus, the man in charge, was still clinging to orders from a Führer who seemed detached from reality. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th, an honor laced with menace. No German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was clear: die where you stand. But Paulus didn't. He didn't even announce the promotion to his staff. By now, the Sixth Army had split into two pockets. One in the north, holding on grimly around the tractor factory. The other in the south, centered in the city center, where Paulus had his headquarters in the basement of a ruined department store. It wasn't exactly Versailles. On January 31st, Soviet forces reached that building. They didn't find a man with pistol in hand, ready to make a final stand. They found Paulus gaunt and exhausted, sitting at a small table, papers strewn around him. He offered no resistance. It was over. Well, half over. The northern pocket, commanded by General Karl Strecker, held out for 2 more days. When Strecker finally surrendered on February 2nd, the Battle of Stalingrad officially ended. After nearly 6 months of fighting, the most brutal urban battle in modern history had concluded not with glory but with silence. The numbers are staggering. Of the roughly 300,000 Axis troops originally encircled, only about 91,000 surrendered. The rest had already died of wounds, cold starvation, or suicide. And those who surrendered, they didn't go home. Not for a very, very long time. Most were sent to Soviet prison camps. Many would perish there from exhaustion, disease, or the long march into captivity. Only around 5,000 would ever see Germany again. It was by any measure a catastrophe. For the Soviets, the cost was even higher. Estimates vary, but the Red Army likely lost over 1 million men, dead, wounded, or missing. Civilian casualties added another layer of horror. The city of Stalingrad had become a charnel house, its population erased or ruined. But despite the price, the message was clear. Nazi Germany could be beaten. The psychological impact was seismic. For the German public, the surrender was a shock. Hitler had promised victory. Now entire families received letters saying their sons, husbands, or fathers were missing in action in the East. The official word surrender was carefully avoided. In the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a rallying cry. Propaganda posters showed the Red Army crushing swastikas under booted feet. Newspapers printed heroic tales, some true, many embellished. But the core truth remained: the unthinkable had happened. The invincible had fallen. Paulus, meanwhile, became a complex figure in post-war memory. Some saw him as a coward for not committing suicide. Others saw him as the only sane man in a madhouse, someone who finally defied Hitler by living. In captivity, he eventually testified against the Nazi regime during the Nuremberg trials, but the soldiers under his command, their stories often ended quietly in snowbanks, in Siberian camps, or in the memories of those few who returned home with sunken eyes and haunted stares. The fall of Stalingrad wasn't just a defeat. It was the unraveling of a myth, the belief that the Wehrmacht was unstoppable, that Hitler's vision of conquest was inevitable, that the East was just waiting to fall. Instead, the world saw that the East could fight back, could bleed, could win, and with that, the long shadow of German defeat began to stretch westward. After the fall of Stalingrad, the reality on the ground was chilling, and not just from the bitter Russian winter. The city was silent, hollowed out, and eerily still. No parades, no celebration. Just the groan of wind through skeletal buildings and the quiet movements of Red Army troops cautiously clearing rubble and counting bodies. Inside the ruined department store where Paulus had surrendered, the Soviets found the remains of a military operation completely undone. Maps still pinned to cracked walls. Typewriters left mid-sentence. Uniforms frozen stiff in abandoned positions. It was as if time had stopped and then been looted by hunger and frost. And still Hitler raged. Back in Berlin, he refused to publicly acknowledge what had really happened. The official announcement on German radio was a masterpiece of denial. It praised the heroic resistance of the Sixth Army and framed the defeat as a noble sacrifice for the future of Europe. The word surrender was avoided like the plague. The phrase fighting to the last bullet was emphasized, even though the actual surrender had come days earlier. Behind closed doors, Hitler was furious, but not at himself. Blame was passed around like vodka at a Soviet victory banquet. Göring, who had promised the disastrous airlift, was privately scolded. Paulus, now a prisoner, was labeled a coward, and the soldiers who surrendered branded as weak. It was a twisted reversal of logic. The only way to die with honor, according to Hitler, was to die without questioning his orders. Anything else was betrayal. But among the German public, something had shifted. Whispers started to circulate. Stalingrad had cracked the armor of Nazi invincibility. If this could happen, if an entire army could be lost in a single city, what else was the regime hiding? For the Allies, the victory was a major morale boost. British and American newspapers plastered Stalingrad across their front pages. Soviet diplomats, once treated with suspicion, now found themselves being congratulated at cocktail parties in London and Washington. Suddenly, Uncle Joe was less the paranoid dictator and more the gritty wartime partner. The Soviets, meanwhile, made sure the symbolism of Stalingrad was fully weaponized. Stalin declared it a hero city. Medals were minted. Survivors were lionized. Red Army generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky saw their reputations soar. The idea that Soviet resilience had saved the world from fascism was repeated so often it became a core tenet of post-war Soviet identity. And indeed, the Red Army had done something astonishing. Not only had they stopped the German advance, but they had destroyed one of the most powerful field armies in Hitler's arsenal. The psychological blow to the Wehrmacht was immense. Soldiers on other fronts heard the stories of frostbitten men eating horses of tanks buried in snow of Paulus, surrendering without a final bullet. German generals took note. Some began to privately question Hitler's strategy. Others dared in whispered conversations to wonder how long the war could continue. The myth of inevitable German victory was dead. In its place, fear. Fear that this could happen again. And it would. Meanwhile, the Red Army began to push outward. Stalingrad wasn't just a defensive victory, it was a springboard. Soviet offensives in the months to come would drive the Germans further west. Town by town, village by village, the tide was shifting, but victory didn't feel triumphant in Stalingrad. The cost had been too high. The city itself was reduced to a haunted ruin. Entire districts no longer existed. The iconic green elevator, so fiercely fought over, was now a shell. The factories that had once produced tractors and tanks were craters. The riverbanks were littered with wreckage and bones. Civilians emerged slowly from cellars, blinking into daylight, unsure of whether they were still alive. Recovery would take years. Some buildings were never rebuilt. Some scars never faded. But through that devastation, the name Stalingrad became more than a location. It became a lesson. For the German High Command, it was a cautionary tale about hubris overreach and ignoring the limits of logistics. For the Soviets, it was proof that sacrifice could lead to salvation. For the world, it was a moment when the direction of the war truly turned. And for the soldiers who survived on either side, it was something far more personal. A memory they would carry for the rest of their lives, of nights without fire, of friends lost in rubble, of orders that made no sense, of a city that ate armies. As February 1943 dawned, the Soviets began the grim task of clearing what was left of the battlefield. The snow-covered rubble of Stalingrad hid thousands of frozen corpses. Some curled into final sleeping positions, others caught mid-motion, still gripping rusted weapons. In places, you couldn't walk a straight line without stepping over bones or shrapnel. The city was a graveyard, and it didn't care what uniform you wore. But while the guns had gone quiet, the repercussions were only just beginning. For Stalin, the victory was a turning point, not just militarily, but politically. Domestically, it allowed him to solidify his position as the great wartime leader. His cult of personality, already well established, swelled further. Statues went up. Films were rushed into production. Street names across the USSR were changed to honor the battle. Stalingrad was no longer just a place, it was an idea. The idea that the Soviet Union, though bloodied and battered, could not only endure, but win. And they made sure the world knew it. Foreign journalists were invited to tour the wreckage, carefully guided through the shattered ruins and shown the cost of German aggression. They weren't just seeing a victory, they were seeing a message. This is what happens when you invade Russia. A message as old as Napoleon, now reissued in Technicolor. But for the Germans, the message was something much darker. The Wehrmacht had now lost not just a battle, but its aura of superiority. Gone were the days when German officers confidently assumed that training discipline and strategy would always win the day. Stalingrad had introduced a new kind of warfare, one where sheer endurance, willpower, and ruthlessness could trump even the most professional army. Across the Eastern Front, the impact was immediate. German morale began to crack. In the months following Stalingrad, desertion rates climbed. German commanders, especially those facing the Red Army, grew more cautious. more hesitant. You could feel the hesitation in their reports, in their delayed offensives, in their endless requests for reinforcements that were no longer coming. Because here's the truth. Germany couldn't afford another Stalingrad. The loss of an entire field army wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a logistical and strategic catastrophe. The equipment alone, tanks, guns, vehicles, would take years to replace. And the manpower, irreplaceable. Especially with German birth rates dropping and casualties rising on multiple fronts. And then there was the propaganda problem. For years, the Nazis had sold their people on a story that Germany was destined to rule, that the East would fall easily, that the Soviets were weak, inferior, doomed. Stalingrad ripped that story to shreds. Suddenly, reality intruded on fantasy. And for a regime built on control of narrative that was almost as dangerous as the military defeat itself, to cover the cracks, the Nazis leaned harder into distortion. State radio glorified the Sixth Army's heroic last stand. Posters spoke of martyrdom. School children were taught that the fallen had bought Germany precious time. But underneath all of it, unease grew. The kind of unease that spreads in quiet rooms behind closed doors over half-finished dinners. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the victory set new expectations. Stalin now believed that total victory was not only possible, it was inevitable. And with that belief came pressure on commanders, on soldiers, on entire industries. If the Red Army could destroy the mighty Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, why stop there? Plans for counteroffensives across Ukraine and Belarus began to take shape. Soviet generals, once cautious, now aimed for bold moves, sweeping maneuvers, encirclements of their own. And to be fair, they weren't wrong to be confident. The Red Army had learned a great deal. The chaotic, desperate defense of 1941 had become the coordinated, relentless advance of 1943. Stalingrad was their school, and the graduation ceremony had been written in ash and blood. But no one came out of it unscathed. The mental toll of the battle on both sides was immense. Survivors reported recurring nightmares, panic at loud noises, a permanent sense of unease. One German soldier taken prisoner, and later released years later, said, "I left part of my soul in that city, frozen to a wall." Soviet veterans didn't fare much better. Many returned home as heroes, only to face suspicion from Stalin's secret police, who feared that anyone who had spent time in enemy territory might have been contaminated. Medals and interrogations came hand in hand. Even those who never fought in the battle began to feel its influence. In Berlin, people whispered about how the tide had turned. In Paris, resistance fighters took heart. In London and Washington, war planners started to believe the Eastern Front might really break the German war machine. And they were right. Stalingrad didn't just mark the end of a battle. It marked the end of an illusion that Nazi Germany could conquer the East through brute force alone. Because the East had teeth, and it had just sunk them deep. When General Friedrich Paulus surrendered to the Soviets on January 31st, 1943, it wasn't just the end of his command, it was the end of a myth. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, not once in history. The rank itself was practically synonymous with victory, or at the very least, glorious death in defeat. Hitler had elevated Paulus to that rank just the day before, fully expecting him to die rather than yield. But Paulus didn't pick up a pistol. He didn't go down in flames. He surrendered. cold, exhausted, humiliated, but alive. This alone sent shockwaves through the Nazi leadership. In Hitler's warped worldview, surrender was a fate worse than death. He saw Paulus's decision as an act of personal betrayal. But for those actually inside the freezing ruins of Stalingrad, it looked a lot more like a long overdue moment of reason. They weren't dying for glory anymore. They were just dying. The moment of surrender wasn't grand or cinematic. Soviet troops found Paulus in a makeshift command post, an icy basement beneath a half-demolished building. There was no last stand, no dramatic declaration. Just a tired man at a desk surrounded by scattered documents, asking what would happen next. What happened next was Soviet captivity. The prisoners marched out in droves, what was left of them. Out of nearly 300,000 men sent into the Stalingrad operation, only about 91,000 remained. And these weren't 91,000 healthy, combat-ready soldiers. Many were emaciated, frostbitten, wounded, and barely able to stand. The Soviets herded them into columns and began the long march east. For some, it would be the last march they ever took. The journey to Soviet prison camps was brutal. There was little food, less water. Wounded men were often left behind or dragged along until they collapsed. Some were transported in open cattle cars through sub-zero temperatures. Many froze to death before they reached their destination. For those who survived the journey, conditions in the camps weren't much better. Cold barracks, forced labor, malnutrition, disease, dysentery spread quickly, so did lice. Out of those 91,000 prisoners, only about 5,000 would eventually return to Germany, some not until a decade after the war had ended. And yet General Paulus did return. In fact, his story took a very strange turn. In captivity, he was treated far better than his men. The Soviets kept him alive for a reason. They saw him as a valuable tool. A former Nazi commander who had turned his back on Hitler. That was propaganda gold. Paulus resisted at first, but over time his views shifted, in part due to his disgust with Hitler's actions, and in part, perhaps, due to the reality of his situation. In 1944, Paulus joined the Anti-Nazi National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-backed organization made up of German POWs. He gave speeches, appeared in leaflets, and condemned the war he had once helped wage. After the war, he testified at the Nuremberg trials, describing Hitler's stubbornness and military delusions. It was an extraordinary transformation from the architect of the Stalingrad disaster to a man who openly criticized the Nazi regime. But he remained a tragic figure, forever haunted by the choices he made and the ones he didn't. Paulus would live out his final years in East Germany under Soviet protection, a living symbol of a war that had broken both his army and his allegiance. Back in the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was already being sculpted into legend. Monuments were planned, medals were issued. The Battle of Stalingrad was declared one of the greatest victories in Russian history, right up there with the defeat of Napoleon in 1812. And to be fair, it was one of the most decisive battles in modern warfare. Strategically, it flipped the balance on the Eastern Front. The Red Army now had the initiative. It would go on to liberate vast swaths of Soviet territory, eventually pushing into Eastern Europe, and by 1945, into Berlin itself. But the cost was unfathomable. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in action. Civilian casualties added hundreds of thousands more. Whole districts were flattened, entire families erased. There were no quiet neighborhoods left in Stalingrad. Every street had become a front line, every house a fortress, every basement a tomb. And for the Germans, the psychological toll was equally immense. After Stalingrad, something changed in the Wehrmacht. An awareness, perhaps. A realization that the war wouldn't end in triumph, but in blood and ruin. Officers began to question orders more frequently. Soldiers spoke more often of retreat of death, of survival, instead of glory. In Hitler's inner circle, paranoia deepened. Loyalty was demanded at all costs. Failures were explained away with conspiracy theories. And the war machine rolled on toward Kursk, toward Normandy, toward the eventual fall of the Reich. But the seed of that fall had already been planted at Stalingrad, where a field marshal surrendered, where an army vanished into the snow, and where perhaps, for the first time, Nazi Germany saw its own mortality. In the immediate aftermath of Stalingrad, both sides had to grapple with what had just occurred, though, in very different ways. For the Soviet Union, the battle became the cornerstone of a new national mythology. For Nazi Germany, it became a gaping wound stitched over with denial and delusion. The physical ruins of the city remained frozen in place for months. Corpses littered the streets, half buried in snow or entombed in collapsed buildings. It wasn't until spring arrived that the thaw began revealing the full scale of destruction. Cleanup teams found entire platoons still seated in firing positions, their rifles frozen in their hands. Wounded soldiers, having died where they fell, now emerged in surreal poses as if caught mid-thought. The city was still, but far from quiet. Civilian survivors, those who had lived in cellars or behind crumbling walls, began emerging too. Gaunt, dazed, blinking in the sunlight. There were stories of mothers who hadn't seen the sky in months, children who hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. For these people, the battle hadn't been military. It had been existence itself. To breathe another day was the only victory they had ever hoped for. Stalin took full advantage of the moment. Within days, he was elevating the defense of Stalingrad into a symbol of Soviet destiny. The city would be rebuilt bigger, better, stronger. A titanic monument would eventually rise. The motherland calls, a statue towering over the skyline with sword in hand, summoning her sons to battle. It was theatrical. It was patriotic. It was in its own way utterly necessary, because the Soviet people needed a victory. They needed to believe that the immense sacrifices of the past 2 years meant something. And in Stalingrad, they found that meaning. The defenders, those who had fought and died in the ruins, became martyrs of a new Soviet legend. Soldiers were lionized. Ordinary citizens who had manned anti-aircraft guns or ferried ammunition became heroes of the state. But of course, reality was more complicated than the myth. Many survivors returned to homes that no longer existed. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, schools, churches, hospitals gone. What remained were stacks of bricks and the overwhelming scent of ash. Reconstruction would take years. Some parts of the city would never recover. Still, the city was rebuilt. That was the Soviet way repair. It rename it, pretend it had always been unbreakable. And in a sense, Stalingrad was unbreakable. not because it withstood everything thrown at it, but because the people inside it refused to vanish. Meanwhile, in Germany, the mood was grim. The official line was one of praise and deflection. State propaganda continued to refer to the Sixth Army as heroes. Hitler blamed their defeat on treachery, incompetence, bad weather, anything but his own disastrous decisions. Goering's failed airlift was never acknowledged for what it was, a fantasy rooted in hubris and maintained by fear. But among the German people, there was no mistaking what had happened. Families received vague telegrams. Your son is missing on the Eastern Front. They read between the lines. They whispered over kitchen tables. They scanned the faces in photographs of the few returning prisoners. Just 5,000 out of more than 90,000, and those who did return came back changed. Many were never quite the same. Pale skeletal, broken by years in Soviet camps. Some had learned Russian. Others had forgotten how to speak. They brought with them not just trauma, but a knowledge that the Nazi dream was crumbling. The defeat at Stalingrad also shifted the diplomatic ground. In neutral countries, attitudes toward Germany cooled. In occupied territories, resistance movements grew bolder. Even in Italy, Mussolini found himself facing awkward questions from his generals. After all, if the Germans could lose there, what did that mean for the rest of the Axis? And in the Allied capitals, Stalingrad electrified war plans. In Washington and London, planners saw the Eastern Front finally pulling its weight. Stalin, once seen as the lesser partner, was now a force of nature. His armies weren't just absorbing German blows, they were striking back. Hard. Churchill called the victory the end of the beginning. Roosevelt sent congratulations. The idea of a joint Allied win suddenly felt achievable. In the months that followed, Soviet offensives would build on the momentum of Stalingrad. German forces in the south began a long, reluctant retreat. Cities like Kharkov-Kursk and eventually Kiev would see their own chapters of struggle. But it was Stalingrad that remained the reference point, the place where the tide had turned. And in the minds of soldiers, it became a warning. For the Wehrmacht, it was a reminder that no army is invincible. For the Red Army, it was proof that determination could outlast tanks' guns and even winter itself. Stalingrad became shorthand for every horror of the Eastern Front: starvation, frostbite, street fighting, and the grotesque futility of modern war. But it also became a rallying cry, and for the rest of the war, it would echo not just in speeches or textbooks or monuments, but in the nightmares of the men who had survived it. If you had to pick one moment where the direction of World War II flipped for good, Stalingrad would be it. Sure, there were other turning points: El Alamein in North Africa, midway in the Pacific. But Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was an unmasking, a shattering of illusions. A moment when Nazi Germany's unstoppable machine clanked to a halt and started making strange sputtering noises. Let's be clear, after Stalingrad, Germany was still dangerous. The Wehrmacht still held vast territory across Europe. Its armies were seasoned, ruthless, and in many places still tactically superior. But the psychological edge, that was gone. For the Soviets, everything changed. Until that point, the Red Army had been mostly on the defensive, retreating, digging in trading land for time. But after Stalingrad, they weren't just surviving. They were attacking, advancing, dictating terms. And Stalin. Well, Stalin started walking a little taller. He had always believed in his own destiny, but now the world was beginning to believe in it too. The Soviet Union, once seen by Western leaders as the awkward, mustachioed guest at the table, was now a full-fledged war power. Allied strategy meetings took a different tone. Negotiations changed. Churchill and Roosevelt, while still wary of communism, had to admit the USSR had bled for the cause. And they were winning. The Red Army launched a string of offensives in 1943 that would push the Germans back through Ukraine, Belarus, and into the heart of Eastern Europe. The war on the Eastern Front would remain brutal. Some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire conflict was still to come. But the strategic initiative was now in Soviet hands. This also meant that Hitler had to start reacting, not directing. His plans for the war had always assumed quick, bold victories, blitzkrieg fast movements, collapsing enemy morale. But now he was bogged down in an attritional war he wasn't prepared for. A war of supply chains, industrial output, and long grinding campaigns across vast hostile terrain. And Germany simply couldn't match Soviet production. Let's put that into perspective. By 1943, Soviet factories were churning out over 1,000 T-34 tanks every month. German industry couldn't keep pace, not just because of Allied bombing, but because their supply lines were too long and their economy too overstretched. And it wasn't just about hardware. It was about manpower. Germany had lost hundreds of thousands of troops at Stalingrad, many of them irreplaceable veterans. Every German soldier who died was one less who could defend the Reich as the Red Army closed in. Every officer lost meant fewer leaders with battlefield experience. Germany began conscripting older men, younger boys, and foreign auxiliaries to fill the gaps. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was learning how to fight more effectively. Their generals were growing more confident, their troops more disciplined, and they were no longer surprised by the Wehrmacht, they were matching it. Even German civilians started to feel the shift. The defeat at Stalingrad wasn't just a military loss, it was a spiritual blow. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to spin it as heroic sacrifice, but you can't hide the truth forever. People noticed the uptick in funerals, the gaps at dinner tables, the packages that never arrived. You also started seeing more rationing, more bombings, more fear. Before Stalingrad, most Germans believed the war would end in victory. After Stalingrad, they began to hope it would just end. The Nazi high command, of course, didn't handle this well. Hitler doubled down. He tightened his grip on military decision-making. He stopped trusting his generals and started giving absurd orders. No retreat hold at all costs. Fight to the last man. Sound familiar? He was replaying Stalingrad over and over in places like Kursk and later in Normandy and eventually in Berlin. Because once you've bet everything on being invincible, what do you do when someone proves you're not? You bluff. You scream louder. You punish anyone who disagrees. You start firing your best officers. You build superweapons. You promise the people one more miracle. Just one more. But there were no more miracles coming. The Allies could now smell victory. And yes, there was still a long road ahead. Normandy hadn't happened yet. Italy was still a mess. Japan was still holding out. But the myth of Nazi inevitability had been broken in a cold city by the Volga. And that mattered. That crack in the armor became a wedge. And that wedge opened the door to everything that came next. Soviet offensives, Allied landings, internal resistance, and eventually the fall of Berlin. So, when we say that Stalingrad was a turning point, we don't just mean it militarily. We mean it philosophically, culturally, emotionally. It was where the war stopped being a German march and became a global reckoning, where dreams of empire began to melt in the snow. Back in Berlin, the aftermath of Stalingrad hit like a thunderclap, loud, jarring, impossible to ignore, yet met with stunned silence from a government determined to keep smiling while the ceiling caved in. Hitler had once declared that German armies would never retreat. Stalingrad made that statement sound like the setup to a very grim joke. The German High Command tried to carry on as if everything was still under control. Maps were redrawn with generous use of red pins and strategic optimism. Briefings were held with forced smiles. But behind the scenes, the generals knew better. They had just lost their best field army. The aura of Wehrmacht invincibility was gone, and the vultures, figurative and literal, were beginning to circle. Hitler himself became more erratic. He took personal command of more military decisions, often micromanaging entire fronts from his increasingly isolated headquarters. His mistrust of his own generals deepened. The few officers who dared suggest retreat or regrouping found themselves reassigned or worse. The Nazi regime had built itself on the illusion of strength, and now that illusion had fractured paranoia, rushed in to fill the gaps. And the German people, they were beginning to feel it. Before Stalingrad, the war had mostly been somewhere else. A newspaper story, a casualty list, a whispered rumor. But now fear began to settle over German cities like soot. Rationing grew more severe. Bombs fell more frequently. Families listened to the radio with unease, no longer expecting victory, but hoping just not to hear another list of the dead. Letters from the front grew darker, more desperate. Soldiers spoke of endless cold, of being outgunned, outnumbered, and tired. Always tired. Some asked whether anyone in Berlin truly understood what was happening. Others stopped writing altogether. Meanwhile, Hitler doubled down on propaganda. He called for total war. He summoned Joseph Goebbels to deliver one of the most infamous speeches of the war, the 1943 Sportpalast speech, where he bellowed to a frenzied crowd, "Do you want total war?" The audience roared. But outside the stadium, people stood in ration lines, burying husbands, and wondering just how much total they had left to give. At the same time, resistance within Germany began to quietly grow. Stalingrad gave courage to those who had doubts. If the regime could suffer such a massive defeat and still insist everything was fine, then clearly something was broken. A few military officers began to plot. Civilians whispered in kitchens. Small acts of defiance took root. No one dared to say it out loud yet, but something had shifted. In the East, the Red Army wasn't just advancing, it was evolving. Soviet generals, once cautious and reactive, became bolder. Strategies were no longer just about defense, but sweeping offensives, encirclements, massive tank battles. The Soviets were learning from German tactics and turning them back with interest. 1 year after Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk would erupt. It would become the largest tank battle in history and another crushing blow to the Germans. But unlike Stalingrad, Kursk wasn't a surprise. It was expected, inevitable even, because once the balance tipped, the war became a game of attrition. And in that game, the Soviet Union had the edge. More men, more tanks, more factories, more willingness to endure unimaginable losses in exchange for a few more kilometers of advance. And let's not forget, every Soviet soldier marching west remembered Stalingrad, remembered what had been done to their homeland, to their cities, to their people. Revenge was no longer just an idea. It was a mission, and that revenge moved methodically, pushing back through Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, town by town, mile by mile, until the Red Army stood at the gates of Warsaw, and then eventually Berlin. But even as Germany's grip weakened, the Nazi regime held on tighter than ever. It's one of the great ironies of history, how totalitarian systems often dig in hardest when defeat is certain. Hitler wasn't preparing for peace. He was preparing for the end. If he couldn't win, he'd take the whole board with him. Back in Berlin, citizens began to feel the weight of that. Bombs rained down more often. Cities were turned into rubble. The war that had once been distant was now in their walls, their basements, their dreams. And still official statements spoke of final victories, of secret weapons, of miracles just around the corner. But the only real miracle had already happened at Stalingrad, because that was where the first domino fell, and once it started, the rest followed, slowly, then faster, until the very heart of the Reich began to beat unevenly, panicked, afraid. It would keep beating for 2 more years. But the rhythm had changed. It was no longer the drumbeat of conquest. It was the slow, inevitable pulse of collapse. In the years that followed, the legacy of Stalingrad didn't fade, it deepened. It hardened into memory, into metaphor, into myth. It became one of those names like Waterloo, like Gettysburg, like Verdun, that you didn't need to explain. You just said it. Stalingrad. And everyone understood what it meant. The battle had changed the course of World War II, but it had also changed the men who fought in it. Those who survived on either side carried something with them for the rest of their lives. Not just wounds, or frostbite, or medals, but silence. An ache that stayed behind their eyes in the corners of rooms in the moments when everything was quiet. For Soviet soldiers, Stalingrad was the ultimate badge of honor. Veterans were revered. Some were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union medals. Others, decades later, were invited to give interviews to share their stories. Many refused. There is nothing heroic in crawling over the bodies of your friends, one survivor said. We won, yes, but the city died. For Germans, the legacy was heavier. Most of the 91,000 who surrendered never returned. Those who did came home years later to a country that didn't know what to do with them. They were sometimes viewed with suspicion, sometimes pity. Many simply tried to disappear into civilian life. The word Stalingrad was rarely spoken in their households. The wounds were too raw, the shame too deep. But history didn't forget. And neither did the Cold War. For decades after 1945, the name of the battle remained politically loaded. In the West, Stalingrad was acknowledged as a military turning point, but not always celebrated, because it reminded everyone just how much the Soviet Union had contributed to defeating Nazi Germany. That was a complicated truth for some leaders to accept, especially as tensions between East and West mounted. In the Soviet bloc, on the other hand, Stalingrad was practically sacred. The battle was turned into school lessons, monuments, parades. Streets were named after it. Paintings were commissioned. Films dramatized it with swelling music and noble speeches. It was retold until it became more than a battle. It became a foundational story. But beneath the layers of propaganda and patriotism, the reality remained. Over 2 million people had died. Many of them young, many of them never buried. It was not a clean victory. It was a victory carved out of agony. The city itself, renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, continued to live in the long shadow of its former name. Still, in moments of national pride, the name Stalingrad would be revived. On anniversaries, on commemorative plaques, in the solemn tones of speeches given at the Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Site, where the towering statue, the Motherland Calls, stands with sword raised, gazing eternally east. The post-war world would learn a lot from Stalingrad lessons about logistics, about urban warfare, about hubris. But perhaps the greatest lesson was about human endurance, about what happens when leaders force armies to fight not for victory, but for ideology, not to win, but to refuse to lose. And that's what Stalingrad was, in the end, not a triumph of strategy, but a refusal to give up. The Germans refused to retreat. The Soviets refused to yield. And somewhere in between, a city vanished. Yet even in ruin it mattered, because it marked the point where one empire began to collapse and another began to rise, where myth met mortar, where two worldviews collided so violently that neither walked away the same. Stalingrad was not the end of the war, but it was the moment the end became possible, the moment the spell broke, the moment the tide turned. And so tonight, as we leave behind the broken stairwells and snow-covered ruins, the frozen rivers and long silences, we carry one final thought, that sometimes in history, the greatest stories are not about victory. They're about survival. And now, as the sounds of distant gunfire fade into memory and the cold winds of the Russian steppe soften to a whisper, we begin to drift away from Stalingrad. The battle is over. The dust has settled. The city sleeps once more, silent, scarred, and still standing. Let your breath slow. The echoes of boots crunching over frozen ground fall quiet. The sharp edges of rubble and broken glass blur into softer shapes. Even the rusted helmets and crumpled letters tucked into coats are still now untouched by time. In the stillness, there's a strange kind of peace. Not because everything turned out well, because it didn't, but because somehow something endured. Through fire, famine, frost, and fear, people kept going. That's the thread that ties history together, from ruined cities to quiet corners of the world where we listen and remember. So let your body sink a little deeper. The snow has stopped falling. The air is warmer here. The lights in the city, flickering distant, aren't fires anymore. They're candles, memorials, reminders of what was lost and what was learned. There is no need to rush back. The past will wait. Tonight the war is far away. The world has turned many times since then. And though the names have changed and the stories have shifted, the quiet truth remains: we remember. Because we must. We listen because it helps us understand. And now your eyes grow heavy. The weight of history drifts into dreams. The cold recedes. The ruins disappear into the night. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of sleep, the city rests. Stalingrad sleeps, and so can you.